Babu, it's great to be talking with you today. You're a British diplomat with over 20 years of experience, a research analyst. You worked with multilateral organizations on conflict and human rights issues. And the reason why I wanted to speak to you right now is that you've also been a frontline negotiator in some of the UN processes on human rights in the UN Security Council. And actually, when I thought about it, 20 years ago we met because we were discussing the right to development. And I'd done a paper which actually I think was like a PA of the right to development in the UN context. So 20 years on, I can finally find out exactly how you go about doing your PAs on a day-to-day basis. So let me start with the first question that we have on the course. We've got a PA framework, and then when we apply this to a multilateral level, of course, we have to ask different questions. So what would be the first question you would ask when you start a PA and you start your negotiations?
So I think the first thing to understand is what are the rules of the game. For me, multilateral organizations aren't like countries, they're more like political ecosystems. They have their overarching rules, but each part of the system has its own structure of sub-rules and practices. There's a logic to why the system and the subsystems work the way that they do. And just like an ecosystem, gradual evolution is possible, but radical change is likely to meet resistance. To get business done, you need to know what the rules are, how to use them, and how they'll affect you. Different multilateral bodies have different functions and powers. They have different memberships and political dynamics. So the Security Council can impose legal obligations on countries, but it's not a good place, for example, to try and agree action on climate change. The rules and the practices can be formal. For example, in the Security Council, its overarching structure is the UN Charter and the Security Council Rules of Procedure.
So Babu, that's really interesting. You talk about rules, formal and informals, but also what's important is how those rules govern practice. So could you give us a concrete example of a negotiation, say in the UN Security Council, where you've had to actually apply those rules?
So over the course of the last month, I've been working on about 4 or 5 different Security Council texts. In most of them, the way that we, as the UK, try and get changes is through the informal process of negotiating by engaging with the country that's tabling the text, asking for changes and amendments to make the text into something that we prefer and can accept. That's essentially an informal process, and it has its own rules in terms of how you propose amendments, how you justify them, and how you come to agreement. In the worst case scenario, if that's not, if agreement isn't possible, informally, we can formally table an amendment that has to be voted on. And that process is governed by the Security Council's formal rules of procedure. The politics of the two are different, and the consequences are different, and you have to approach them differently.
So Babu, what's really key in a PA is to understand the status of the different rules. What happens when the rules are themselves contested in a multilateral negotiation?
So it's really important to understand that the rules aren't technical things, or aren't only technical things. They're mechanisms and instruments that can be used politically and may themselves be contested. So, for example, if the UK wanted to bring a country situation to the Security Council, either to discuss it or to negotiate a text, which UN rule would apply to that? Would it be sovereignty or human rights? Because the answer to that question influences whether a particular idea or a proposal even gets to the table. So sometimes the reason that the Security Council doesn't discuss particular situations is because countries have interpreted the rules in a way that doesn't allow that particular issue to even get in front of the Council.
Thanks, Babu. Now let's move on to another question. So a key step in a PA process is to understand the actors. So how would you go about doing that in a multilateral negotiation?
The first thing is to map the key stakeholders. Most of the time, you'll be, we as the UK are negotiating with other states. So we need to understand what those states' interests are, whether it's interests in a country or interests in an issue. But we also need to marry that with what those countries think about a particular organisation or a body. For example, a country might agree with the UK on the importance or the imperative around a particular human rights situation, but they might not agree that it's something that should be discussed in the Security Council, because the Security Council's function is to consider international peace and security, and they would argue that human rights doesn't fall into that bracket. Sorry, I paused there when I shouldn't have done. Can we start that again?
Go ahead, start again.
Okay. So the first thing is to map the stakeholders at an individual level. For the UK, most of the time, we're negotiating with other states, and it's important to understand what those states' interests are, be it on an issue or in a country. But we also need to understand what they think about the particular organisation or body in which the negotiation is taking place. So, for example, a country might agree with the UK that the situation in Myanmar, the human rights situation in Myanmar, is terrible and it needs to be resolved urgently. But they might not agree with the UK that it should be discussed at the Security Council, because the primary responsibility of the Security Council is international peace and security, that shouldn't extend to include human rights situations. When we're doing our stakeholder analysis, we need to focus on those countries whose support will be most necessary to get a particular motion passed, but also those countries who can block or neuter any particular proposal that we make. When it comes to the Security Council, the obvious group of actors to focus on are the permanent members, because they can veto proposals. But in the Security Council and in most other bodies across the UN, you also need to get at least a majority of the members to agree before a particular proposal is adopted. When you're looking at the countries that you're negotiating with, some may be more important than others, either because a particular country or group of countries may affect how a decision is to be implemented, or because they will be able to mobilize other countries to support or oppose the measures that the Council or whichever UN body you're in is planning to adopt. It's also important to remember to distinguish between actors that are in the foreground, those that you're negotiating with directly, and actors that may be in the background. So it's often the case that actors, be they countries or opposition groups or some other kind of non-state actor that has an interest in what's being considered, might try and influence the negotiations through a proxy. This arrangement might be institutionalized or it might be ad hoc. But in either case, it's important to be aware of that so you have a full understanding of what the key countries that you're dealing with bring to the table.
Babu, could you add a bit? What do you mean by a proxy? Could you give me an example of a proxy?
So there are lots of different permutations of this. The most institutionalized example on the Security Council is the system of pen holdership, where one country, one member of the Security Council, takes responsibility for drafting a resolution, putting it in front of the rest of the members of the Council and negotiating it through to conclusion. where that's a text on a where that's a text on a country situation, the pen holder will often work with the country that the text addresses to understand what they want out of the text, what they don't want to see in the text, and communicate those concerns to the rest of the council and try and get a text that in the end meets the concerns both of the members of the council and wherever possible of the country that's being considered. The UK, for example, holds the pen on resolutions on Somalia. So as an early step in Security Council resolutions on Somalia, we will speak to the Somali government and other actors that won't be represented in council negotiations, for example, the African Union, to try and understand what their interests are and how they can be reflected in both the negotiations themselves and the final text. Informally, it's sometimes the case that countries will lobby actors will lobby countries that are members of the council. So, for example, on Security Council resolutions on the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli conflict, it's common that those Middle Eastern countries that are closest to the conflicts, even if they're not represented on the council, will try and influence the negotiations, either through, say, an Arab member which is on the council, or through another member of the council, and that's essentially an informal process.
What's specific about the multilateral level, of course, is that you don't just have a series of bilateral relationships. You also operate with different groups of countries coming together, so you have to analyze those groups of actors. Can you give us some tips on how to do that?
Yeah, so in most multilateral forum, most countries operate as part of a group. The Security Council is a bit of an exception, but groups are really important, and group membership is really important in understanding how countries behave. Group positions may sometimes trump national positions. For example, a country with a good domestic record on women's rights might, in the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council, pursue a conservative position on sexual and reproductive health rights, because that's the position of the group that they belong to, and their membership of that group and relationships with other members of the group are more important than representing their domestic record. Group behaviour is often a better explanation for how countries vote on UN resolutions than whether or not they agree with the UK. Some groups are formal, like the European Union. Others are informal, like the A3 group of African members of the Security Council. Not every group will be active on every issue. So the Organisation of the Islamic Conference is a grouping that we often see in human rights fora active on issues of freedom of religion or belief, but they're not particularly, but they don't necessarily convene on other issues. So the choice of the group depends on both the issue and the forum. Some groups are more coherent than others. The European Union, by some orders of magnitude, is by far the most disciplined and most coherent. Groups may have informal or formally allocated leaders, countries that either are formally tasked to convene everybody else and represent positions, or informally lead opinion forming and position forming on a particular issue. Countries that are not don't always find themselves in the same group may sometimes coordinate on specific issues in an ad hoc manner. So, for one example of that would be the tactical alliances that we sometimes see between conservative Christian and Islamic governments to oppose sexual and reproductive health rights.
A key element in the PA framework on the calls, Babu, is about moving from analysis to action. So here we're talking about the UK's role in multilateral negotiations in the Security Council or the Human Rights Council. Can you tell us a bit how you go about developing a UK position, taking on board the political economy analysis that you've been doing?
Well, I think the first thing to be clear on is what it is that the UK wants to achieve, and then how a particular negotiation contributes to that, and then how we secure the outcome that we want from that negotiation. The first step in that, or a key step in that, is identifying all of the relevant HMG stakeholders. The UK rarely has one single set of positions or objectives on a particular issue or country situation. For example, we want to use multilateral tools to deal with human rights and conflict, but at the same time, we also want to keep the UN bills down. So it's important to have those parts of the government that are responsible for those different sets of issues involved in the development of a UK position so that we have something coherent. Domestic ministries will also often have relevant positions and objectives. A key step is convening the HMG stakeholders to discuss what the objectives should be or what UK objectives should be, how others are likely to react to them, and what approach to use to achieve them. Critically, it's essential to make sure that the policy leads on the multilateral bodies are involved, not only those who lead on a particular issue or a country. And also, don't forget that it's the job of our now integrated posts overseas, our network of high commissions and embassies, to advise on and influence the national positions of the key negotiating partners and other influences. Where you can do a set piece PEA for a particular organisation or negotiation, do. There isn't any reason why you can't apply the same basic principles of PEA to a multilateral setting. I've seen it done many, many times, but I've never seen it called a PEA. So it may be that you shouldn't get hung up on labeling it as a PEA, but the practice of doing what I've just described is not something alien or unusual.
Babu, would you be able to give us an example of a recent experience you've had developing a UK position on a specific issue, either in the UN Security Council or the Human Rights Council?
So on a couple of negotiations that I've been involved in over the last 12 months on the renewal of the mandate for the UN peacekeeping operation in Mali, as well as the renewal of the African Union peace operation in Somalia. In each case, all of the relevant actors in the FCDO, in the Ministry of Defence, but also including our posts overseas, our posts in New York, High Commission New York, in Mali, our embassy in Bamako, and on Somalia, our embassy in Mogadishu, were involved in understanding and clarifying what the UK wanted out of each negotiation, discussing and agreeing who the key interlocutors in each case would be, what their positions were likely to be, how they were likely to respond to what the UK wanted, which actors the UK therefore needed to work with in advance of the negotiation, and how to approach each of them. And then as the negotiation, and that same kind of arrangement was then used to oversee the course of the negotiation as different parts, as each text developed and different proposals were made by the actors, so that we were able to constantly update our own understanding of what our negotiating partners, as well as those who weren't at the table but were in the background, wanted, so that we could help and advise our negotiators in New York on what positions to take. In each case, we ended up with an outcome that the UK was happy with, but not without problems on the way. So the PEA analysis that we didn't predict every single problem that we encountered, but had we not done it in advance, we would have been far less prepared and far less able to achieve the outcome that we wanted. But in neither case did we describe what we were doing as a PEA analysis. But in reality, that's what it amounted to.
I remember when I used to work for DFID, the Department for International Development, the UK was seen as really radical in the UN system. We were always pushing for reforms and we were ahead of our times. Do you find that as well in your negotiations, the Security Council, the Human Rights Council? Is the UK pushing hard on issues?
Yeah, I think often that is the case, particularly in the Human Rights Council and in many areas of the Security Council's work as well. I think it's important to come back to my earlier comments about the rules of the game. It's often the case that the UK is in the position of trying to either push the boundaries of how those rules are applied. So, for example, in the Security Council, raising issues of human rights, raising issues of sexual violence, raising issues of children armed conflict, raising increasingly these days issues of climate change and environment, versus the predominant view of what the rules and the competencies of those bodies are. So for most members of, let's say, the Security Council in this case, and I'll come back to the Human Rights Council, those are not issues that the rules were designed and intended to accommodate. So the UK is often regarded by others as a revolutionary country or seeking revolutionary change in a way that for them is often unwelcome, because any change to the system of rules and practices affects the power dynamics within those bodies. So it's often the case that we're regarded as people trying to actually upset the system and upset the rules, as opposed to countries that feel themselves entitled to preserve the rules as they were originally intended. Good example of that, for example, is to compare the approach between China and the UK. China regards itself actually as the guardian of preserving the system as it exists, because the system as it exists is anchored around issues of sovereignty, non-intervention, and so on. They're hardwired into the system. They protect the interests of China and they protect the interests of many other members of the UN Security Council, of the UN overall, whereas the UK is constantly trying to push against those boundaries. The same point applies to the Human Rights Council, where we have traditionally championed intrusive scrutiny of countries' human rights records. For many countries, that's not what the system is for. That's not what it was created for. And that's not what they want to see out of it. So it's important to understand that one of the reasons why we get as much resistance as we do is because we are trying to bend the rules and change the rules. And to understand that the resistance is as much about preserving the system as it is about countering the UK's views on a particular issue or on a particular country.
When you do negotiations or you plan for negotiations, sometimes things happen really quickly. Actually, your minister might get a phone call during the night and you might have to feed them lines really quickly. So can you give us some tips on how you would go about doing this kind of thoughtful work, understanding interest, incentives, groups, networks, formal, informal relationships? How can you do that quickly and effectively?
Yeah, so that's really important point, and actually that probably takes up the bulk of how we deal with texts. Over the course of the last month, I've dealt with at least 3 texts in the Security Council that we hadn't anticipated being tabled and suddenly came out of the blue. And sometimes even when you do have notice that something's coming down the line, there just isn't the bandwidth to convene the kind of process and coordination that I've described. So at a minimum, be clear what it is that you want to achieve and what it is that you want to resist. In most cases, that means be aware of your general policy objectives. Then as you look at a text, particularly if you're unfamiliar with the body or if you haven't dealt with these negotiations in the past, ask the lead on the multilateral organization. That may be someone in Open Society's directorate if you're dealing with a human rights body like the Human Rights Council, or someone in UN Multilateral Directorate if you're dealing with the Security Council, what the rules of the game are for that particular body. Part of their job is to know how to get business done. And they can also tell you who else you need to speak to understand what it is that's going on and how the forum in which your substantive positions need to be represented works. It's also worth looking at how previous negotiations on the same or similar subjects have gone. That can often help you understand what the range of actors are that you're dealing with and how they've behaved. It's often the case that internal reporting is the best source of understanding on this. So in sum, a quick phone call and a scan of the files should be doable in an hour. And an hour may sometimes be half the time that you've actually got available to look at a text and give a view. Whatever the case, make sure you capture your thinking and what happens. So make sure that you record by email or some other capturable method what it is that you're proposing and why. Both for yourself, so that the next time you do deal with an issue, you know why something has happened in the past. Bear in mind, many multilateral negotiations are either recurrent or iterative. Or if it's not for you, do it for your successor, so that when they arrive, they will have something to look back at and understand what the rules of the game are and what the actors are. In any case, if there's even a remote possibility that you'll deal with multilateral negotiations, do the practitioner level learning in the multilateral faculty of the International Academy. There's a lot of thought and expertise that's gone into it, and it is very focused on all of these tradecraft issues, as well as the rules of the various different multilateral bodies that we deal with and negotiate in.
Babu, I would really like to thank you because you've taken our PA framework and you've seen how it's relevant for negotiation at the multilateral level. So if I can summarize, I think you've said, understand the rules of the game, formal and informal. And don't take just what's in front of you at face value, understand what's going on behind the scene. Mm-hmm. You've said, understand the actors, both individual actors, state and perhaps non-state actors, groups of actors, unholy alliances sometimes. Also understand how the UK might be perceived as one of the actors. And finally, we've talked again, like in the PA framework, we talk about how moving from the analysis to the action. And really, you've highlighted all the resources within the UK system that you already have to develop your position. And you finish with something I really liked about being iterative. Write down what you do, learn, and then the next time try again.